They thought I wouldn't notice that shove. At 78, people like to assume your senses have dulled like an old blade. But I felt everything. The placement of each finger on the back of my wheelchair, the faint tremor of the wooden planks as they pushed me toward the Chesapeake Bay. "Just a little more," a voice whispered. Then the hard shove, the ruthless splash of water, and immediately after, the horrifying sound of footsteps walking away, as if I were already dead. The cold swallowed me whole. Water climbed up my shoulders, my face, threading through every strand of my hair. I didn't scream. I let myself sink just a little, long enough to hear their voices echoing above. Greedy, murky voices, without the slightest tremor of fear. "She drowned. Now we have $11 million. Those were the first words I heard after they tried to kill me. Not my name, not panic, not even a hint of remorse, just money. People often equate old age with helplessness, with forgetting how to fight for air, how to cling to life. But I grew up on the Atlantic coast, and even now, when my legs betray me and my cane waits faithfully by my bedside every morning, my body still remembers the water. I pushed away the heavy, waterlogged dress, leaned to one side, and began to swim, slow, strained, but determined, toward the darkness beneath the dock at Middle Branch Marina. When my fingertips brushed the rough, barnacle-covered beam, I nearly laughed. After everything they had done over the years, the quiet humiliations, the sighs of contempt, the conversations they carried on over me as if I were just a piece of outdated furniture, this was the moment they chose to underestimate me, and it would be the last mistake they ever made. If you think being pushed into the water was the peak of betrayal, wait until I returned home that night. Because it was only when the door closed behind me that I understood. The biggest enemy wasn't just out there by the bay, it was standing inside my own family. Stay with me to see what awaited Dolores King when she survived and came back. I surfaced behind the paneling of the dock, hidden just beyond sight. Their voices drifted from somewhere above, low, urgent tones buried beneath the gentle lapping of water. Reggie Carter's tense voice, Marquis Bell's shaky breathing, and Simone, my daughter, still silent. Of course Simone stayed silent. Silence had become her specialty, her shield, her habit, and the cowardice she never dared to confront. "She went under fast," one of the men said. "The cameras won't catch anything. It's done." Cameras? My hand stiffened around the slippery wooden beam. They didn't even bother to look back. They never cared about anything that didn't benefit them. A security light flickered near the boathouse, and right then, I remembered Middle Branch Marina had installed a new surveillance system this spring, wide-angle, motion-activated, continuous recording on weekends. They didn't know that, but I did. As they began walking away, convinced they had solved all their financial troubles in one afternoon, I mapped out the way back to shore in my mind. The cold numbed my hands, my legs, even my jaw, but I kept moving, inch by inch, slow, painful, but relentless, until the mud at the bottom touched my palms and I could drag my body forward. The world above was cruel in its calm. The afternoon light, dragonflies gliding across the surface, laughter from teenagers on the other side of the bay. Life went on as if my death, or what they believed was my death, were nothing more than a pebble dropped into a pond, gone the moment it sank. I sat there for a while, drenched, hair plastered to my scalp, my torn dress clinging to my skin, my heart pounding but steady. Not panicked, not shattered. Something inside me had cracked, yes. But it wasn't fear. It was clarity. For years I had known they circled me like hungry fish waiting for the scent of blood. For years I told myself I had to forgive, to endure, to love them beyond the flaws they clung to as excuses. And for years, they used that kindness like a convenient ladder to climb over me. But today, they chose to show me who they truly are, and I would never blind myself again. There was a moment, as I wiped the mud from my hands, when I wondered, if I had really died in the Chesapeake this afternoon, Would any of them have shed a single tear? The thought didn't sadden me as much as I expected. It simply made one truth clearer. The family I had protected all these years may never have protected me. But before I tell you what happened after I dragged myself across that muddy bank, let me go back to the moment everything began, to when $11 million entered my life. People think money is the answer, but sometimes it's merely the thing that strips bare the true faces of those you love most. 15 years ago, Walter King, my husband, was injured in an accident at the Baltimore port. He worked as a longshoreman, a job that demanded strength, rhythm, and trust in the massive machines around him. That day, the lifting equipment malfunctioned. Walter suffered severe back injuries, and from that moment on, he could never return to work. He was not the type to enjoy lawsuits. Walter was born to fix the world with his hands, not sit across from steel-toothed corporations and ambitious lawyers. But he did it. We had to, because the injury didn't just break his back, it broke the future we had built together. 6 years, paperwork, files, lawyers, hearings that drained the man I loved. But in the end, we won. $11 million. At first, that money felt like a miracle. We paid off every debt, bought this house in Baltimore, helped Simone put down the deposit for her first apartment, and supported Marquis Bell, Walter's nephew, through trade school after the boy's mother died. People warned us to be careful. Money can change people. But this was family. We loved each other, or at least I thought we did. Walter died 4 years after the lawsuit ended. His heart simply couldn't endure anymore. He passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand holding mine until his final breath. And then I remained, alone, with $11 million, and a family suddenly very, very invested in my well-being. Reggie Carter entered Simone's life not long after Walter died. He was charming, tall, confident smile, always knowing exactly what to say to put people at ease. Worked in finance, or at least that's what he claimed. "Mom, I want to introduce you to Reggie," Simone said, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. I wanted to believe in my daughter. I wanted to believe she'd found a good man. And so I welcomed Reggie into my home, into my life, and eventually into my bank account. "Mrs. Dolores," he said, just a month after the wedding, sitting in this very armchair, "I worry about you. Elderly folks shouldn't stress over finances. Let me help you. Just sign a few papers, simple financial authorization. If anything happens, I'll take care of things for you." His voice was warm, gentle, like a dutiful son. I signed, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. The first sign something was wrong came when my medical insurance bill skyrocketed. I called the company, and they told me I'd switched to a premium plan. "I didn't request that," I said. "A man named Reggie Carter requested it on your behalf, ma'am. He has authorization." I hung up, my heart racing. But when I asked Reggie, he just smiled. "It's for your own good. The old plan didn't cover enough. I want you well protected." Simone nodded approvingly. "Mom, Reggie knows what he's doing." I let it go, because they were family. Then came the small withdrawals, 500 here, 1,000 there. Reggie said they were household expenses. I didn't question it. I trusted them. Marquis began showing up more often, always with a new story, a business venture that almost succeeded, a friend who betrayed him, a sudden urgent debt. "Aunt Dolores, can you lend me $5,000? Just until the end of the month." I gave it. Then another $5,000. Then $10,000. Nothing was ever paid back. Every time unease crept in, I told myself, they're family. They're just struggling. But their struggles never ended. And then I realized they no longer saw me as a mother or an aunt. They saw me as a breathing bank account. One evening, I sat in the living room staring at the family photos on the shelf. I tried to remember the last time Simone hugged me tightly, the last time Marquis asked me a question not related to money, the last time Reggie walked into my home without a financial solution. I couldn't remember. And when a family becomes hard to remember, It usually means they changed long ago, you just didn't dare face it. One winter night, 3 months before they pushed me into the Chesapeake, everything became painfully clear. I was reading in the living room. Simone and Reggie had stopped by. They thought I had fallen asleep. I heard them whispering in the kitchen. "We can't keep doing this," Simone said, her voice trembling. "My mom is asking about the money." "Then we need to move faster," Reggie replied. "She's old, Simone. She doesn't need all that money. We do." "What are you planning?" "I'm handling it, but you need to trust me, and you need to stay quiet." Silence. Always that silence. I sat there in the dark, clutching my book but unable to read another word. My heart shattered, not because of the money, but because of the betrayal, because the daughter I once cradled, once rocked to sleep, once comforted through tears, was now standing in my kitchen, conspiring against me. And I knew, from that moment on, money wasn't the only thing they wanted anymore. One day soon, they would want me gone. By the time I dragged myself back from the dock, the sun had already slipped behind the pines, leaving that pale last light that leaks over the world just before night closes in. My dress clung to my skin like a second, freezing layer. My hair dripped down my back. My shoes scraped and crunched with every step. I must have looked like a ghost that had just crawled out of the bottom of a lake, a ghost that was supposed to stay down there. I walked slowly, stiffly, sometimes having to grip the railing to keep my balance. My legs trembled from the cold and exhaustion, but they still carried me farther than anyone in my family could ever imagine. When I pushed the front door open, the house greeted me with its usual silence. No smell of food in the kitchen, no voices drifting through, no sign that anyone had stopped by. Just the scent of old wood, paper, and tea leaves, things that had proven more loyal than my own blood. Nothing was disturbed. No one had rushed over to check whether I was alive or dead. Of course they hadn't. I closed the door, and only then did I notice my hands shaking. Not from fear, just from the shock settling in. I sat down on the little chair by the entryway and peeled off my soaked cardigan. Water dripped onto the wooden floor. My breathing sounded loud, raspy, but steady. The hallway clock kept ticking its slow, indifferent rhythm, same as every night. It should have calmed me. Instead, it felt like a reminder that this house had treated me more kindly than the people I had raised in it. After a while, I stood up, my legs feeling as though they'd just been pulled out of ice water. I rubbed them to warm them, then shuffled toward the kitchen. Habit led the way, not thought. I set the kettle on the stove, even though my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the cup. Old women like me aren't meant to be crawling out of open water after their own child has tried to drown them. But habit always stays. Before the water had time to boil, I glanced out the window. A car rolled slowly past the house. The headlights were familiar. Reggie Carter. He didn't stop, didn't even slow down. He was probably just checking whether there were any police cars parked outside my house. Strange. I used to think the cruelest thing he'd ever done to me was exploit my generosity. Turned out, exploitation has a bottom. And once they hit it, they're willing to shove you straight over the edge. The kettle clicked off with a soft ding. I made tea but didn't drink it. I only held the cup between my hands, letting the warmth seep into my frozen fingers. I should have called someone, the police, a neighbor, a doctor, anyone. But my mind kept circling around one bare, simple truth. They believed I was dead, and that gave me time. Time to think, time to act, time to slip into the cracks of their foolish assumption like water seeping through rotten boards. I changed into dry clothes, folded the wet ones, and put them in the laundry basket. Not because they mattered, but because I needed to do something ordinary, something untouched by the taste of lake water or the smell of betrayal. Then I sat in the living room. Walter's picture still stood on the mantel, where it had been for 15 years. He was smiling, sun-browned, squinting at the camera on the day we bought this house. Back then, it had felt too big for just the two of us. Now it felt empty enough to echo. "You'd know what to do," I whispered. My voice broke, not from grief, just from sheer exhaustion. Walter had always seen danger before I did. I was the one who forgave too easily, trusted for too long, swallowed too much in the name of peace. Peace that, in the end, only ever belonged to the ones willing to hurt me. My thoughts drifted back to the bay, the feel of the water sucking at my legs, the wooden surface of the dock, their voices, and Simone's silence. My daughter, silent while her own mother was being murdered. Fear, dependency, weakness. No excuse would ever be enough. Sitting there in the dark, I realized something I should have seen years ago. It isn't the betrayal itself that breaks you, but the moment you understand you're the one who taught your betrayers how to step over you so lightly. Awakening can hurt just as much as falling into cold water, but it brings you back to life. And that night, I came back to life. I leaned back, letting the house creak around me as if it too were breathing after a shock. Outside somewhere, a stray dog barked once and fell silent. I knew they would come soon, not to check on me, but to decide how to explain the drowning accident. Maybe tomorrow, maybe a few days from now. They would wait, long enough to make the story sound reasonable. Let them wait. The cameras at the marina had recorded everything, and I had to be careful. One wrong move, and they would twist the story into confusion, falling into the water, loss of control, anything to keep their hands clean. I closed my eyes, letting the silence wrap around me like a heavy blanket. Not for comfort, for gathering strength. Tonight was not for decisions. Tonight was for breathing, for letting my body recover, for accepting that a war had just begun. They thought the water would finish me, but all the water did was wash me clean. Around 4 a.m, when the sky's gray-blue was still undecided between night and day, I sat up. My joints protested, my breath thin, but I knew that staying in bed would only feed the fear. I switched on the bedside lamp. Warm light washed over the room, dust on the dresser, the old blanket, the photos lined up along the wall. Simone at 12, grinning with a gap between her teeth. Walter in his work uniform, holding a fishing rod. Marquis at 9, leaning against me like a child who truly needed a family. I got up and went to the bathroom. The woman in the mirror looked far older than I felt inside. White hair, sunken eyes, skin creased by time and by too many rounds of forgiveness. But there was something else there now, a slight tightness around the mouth, a harder glint in the eyes. Determination. I washed my face, letting the water run down my neck, rinsing away the mud, the cold, and the ache of the night before. Wrapping my robe around me, I walked into the kitchen. The kettle felt heavier than usual, or maybe my hands were weaker. I filled it, set it on the stove, and leaned against the counter. The small sounds, the hiss, the metal heating, kept me anchored in reality. I took out my old address book, edges frayed, full of phone numbers written in familiar handwriting. Walter's pen, strokes still carved deep into a few pages. My fingers came to rest on the name Curtis Langford, Walter's lawyer from 20 years ago. He'd retired. But men like him never really leave the game. Not yet. It wasn't time to call. As long as they believed I was dead, I still had the advantage. The kettle whistled. I poured tea, letting the steam fog my glasses. I just held the cup to remind myself that my hands were still useful, still stronger than they thought. I spread letters and bills out on the table. Strange charges. Insurance letters talking about the cognitive decline of the patient, me. Letters I had never been allowed to see. Reggie had blocked or forged them. He had always been too smooth, too confident, too good at looking right. Simone had once said, "Mom, he pushes me to do better." I had told her there was a difference between a man who lifts you up and a man who stands on your shoulders. Simone laughed, said I worried too much. Now, I don't know what she would say, or if she would say anything at all. When the clock struck 6, I put on my cardigan and opened the front door. The morning air was knife-sharp and clear. Birds sang in the trees, unaware that a woman who had nearly died was standing on her front walk. I walked to the end of the driveway. My legs held, just enough. I looked down the quiet street. No cars, no people. Not a soul knew that the woman they thought had died was breathing her way back into the world. I took a deep breath. My chest burned a little, but the feeling was startlingly real. Today, I told myself, is not the day I confront them. Today is the day I start taking back everything they took. All the years, all the money, all the dignity. I went back inside and closed the door gently. My hand was steady now. The water hadn't killed me. It had only washed me clean. By mid-morning, I felt steady enough to drive. Not comfortable, steady. At 78, you don't confuse the two. Comfort is a warm blanket. Steadiness is knowing your hands won't slip off the steering wheel, even when everything around you is falling apart. I dressed carefully. Simple slacks, a thick sweater, and the brown coat Walter bought me on our last anniversary. It still carried a faint cedar smell. I brushed my hair, pinned it back neatly, and took one last look at myself in the hallway mirror. A woman who had just crawled out of a lake stared back at me, but she was standing upright. Her face was a bit pale, but her eyes were clearer and sharper than they had been in years. Every softness I had ever extended to my family now felt like water draining from a cracked bowl, no longer lingering on my features. I grabbed my purse, my keys, and the old cardboard folder where I kept all my important documents, even though, truthfully, none of them had ever felt truly important until last night. Then I stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and drove to the bank. Chesapeake Federal Bank. It's not the kind of building that impresses people who measure life in dollar signs, but I'd always liked it. The windows were always spotless. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish. The tellers had known me for years, long before $11 million ever passed through my hands. Inside, the lights were bright enough that my eyes needed a moment to adjust. A young man at the reception desk smiled at me. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell. King. Do you have an appointment today?" "I need to see whoever manages the finances on my account," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. He checked his computer, nodded, then led me to a glass-walled office. Inside sat a woman in her 40s, crisp suit, warm eyes, and that professional politeness people reserve for elderly clients who seem harmless and unlikely to cause trouble. "Mrs. Dolores King," she said, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Rachel Dunbar. It's a pleasure to meet you. Please have a seat. Are you all right? You look a little pale." "I'm fine," I answered, taking the chair. "I need to review all of my accounts. All of them." She blinked. "All of them?" "Every automatic payment, every transfer, every power of attorney I've signed over to family." Her expression shifted. More than surprise, not yet suspicion. "That will take quite some time," she said. "We may have to go through a lot of entries." "I have time." And for the first time in many years, that wasn't just something I said to be polite. Rachel opened my file on her computer. For several minutes, the only sounds were the steady tapping of keys and the soft hum of the air conditioner above. Then a small frown formed on her forehead. "Mrs. King, are you aware of these payments?" She turned the screen toward me. Lines of transactions filled the display. Monthly transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, service subscriptions I had never used, health insurance premiums that had ballooned far beyond my plan, payments on loans that had nothing to do with my life. Reggie's fingerprints were everywhere, a quiet, confident kind of theft, designed so no one would notice, until the well had run dry. "Yes," I said slowly, "I need to cancel all of them. Every single one. Today." She hesitated. "Some of these were set up under a power of attorney you signed 3 years ago. It authorizes your son-in-law to—" "I know what it authorizes him to do," I cut in. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "I want to revoke it." She studied me a moment, perhaps weighing whether I truly understood what I was asking. But something in my face, the fatigue, the clarity, or a strange kind of calm, must have answered for me. Rachel nodded. All right, we can start the revocation process. I'll need to verify your identity first for security reasons. Of course. While Rachel stepped out to print the forms, I sat alone, my hands folded in my lap. Funny, people think the life or death battle happened in the water, wrestling with death, but often the real fight takes place at a polished wooden desk between stacks of black and white paperwork. Last night, they tried to drown me in the lake. This morning, I was preparing to drown their entire scheme, in the very numbers they'd created. Rachel returned with a thick stack of papers. Revoking this will freeze all accounts he currently controls, she said. There will be consequences. He may contact you. He may object strongly. I'm counting on it. She gave a small, sympathetic smile. Most clients your age don't take such drastic steps. I'm not most women my age, I replied, soft but firm. 1 page at a time, I signed my name. A strange calm spread through my chest. Not relief. Relief comes when the danger has passed. What I felt was something different. A reclaiming, a putting the name Dolores King back where it belonged, into my own hands. When we finished, Rachel stacked the papers neatly. There's one more thing, she said. Your account history shows a large number of withdrawals over the past year. Some big, some small, all of them processed through that power of attorney. Would you like to review them in detail? I nodded. Yes, every last dollar. She laced her fingers together, her gaze softening. I'm very sorry. Why? I asked. For what your family has done to you. I held her eyes. So am I. She printed out a detailed statement, page after page. The numbers lined up in rows, telling a story more brutal than any accusation. Vacations I had never taken, medical bills that weren't mine, luxury shopping sprees charged under my name, loans, debts, lies. I gathered the entire stack and slid it into my folder. This time, my hands didn't shake. When I stepped out of the bank, the late morning sun had climbed high enough to warm the sidewalk. People hurried past, wrapped up in the ordinary rhythms of their day, not giving me a second glance. They had no idea that a woman her family believed to be dead had just begun taking her life back, piece by piece. The water hadn't ended me. Now it was paperwork's turn to end what they started. I came home from the bank carrying a folder so thick it was almost impossible to close. Every sheet of paper inside felt like a confession someone had signed with my name. Standing in the hallway, I hugged it to my chest for a moment. Heavy things always have a way of giving off their own odd warmth. They can weigh you down, but if you lean into them, they can also help you stay upright. I set the folder on the kitchen table and made more tea. My body needed something warm after the strain of the morning, even though my hands were far steadier than they believed I was capable of. While waiting for the tea to steep, I looked out the window into the backyard. The old maple tree was still standing as it had for decades, its branches thinner now, its trunk rough and gnarled, but never once submitting. I understood it more than ever. By midday, the house was still utterly quiet. No phone calls, no knocking, no hurried footsteps racing up to see whether I was alive or dead. Of course not. In their minds, I was still at the bottom of the bay. They were probably sitting somewhere right now, discussing how to act devastated, crafting their story for the neighbors, and deciding who among them should be the one to deliver the bad news. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. In the afternoon, I heard gravel shifting on the driveway, not rushed, just the lazy crunch of footsteps belonging to someone who still believed the world sat comfortably in the palm of his hand. Through the window, I watched Marquis walk up onto the porch. My nephew. The boy who had once been gentle and polite, now a man always in debt, always worried, his hands twisting at his sleeves like someone forever bracing for the next familiar disaster. He didn't knock right away. He stood there, eyes flicking over the driveway, the windows, the neighbors, like a man about to take something he wasn't proud of. Finally, he knocked. 3 soft taps, just like when he was little and afraid of waking Uncle Walter from his afternoon nap. I opened the door. His face froze. If fear had a sound, it would be the sharp, quick intake of breath he just made. His eyes widened so much I thought he might collapse right there on the porch. "Aunt Dolores, you... He swallowed hard. "I thought you..." "You thought what?" I asked. You weren't home last night. We were worried about you." "I was in my house," I said evenly. "Where else would I be?" He looked at me as if I'd just climbed out of my own grave, lake water still dripping onto the floor. "You weren't home last night," he insisted. "We came by. I knocked." "We?" I repeated, placing weight on the word. "You and who?" That knocked him off balance. His fingers twitched at the hem of his shirt. I just... A quick glance down at the porch. "I came to ask you about the loan." Of course. Always the loan. Always urgent. Always the last chance that never turned into anything except more requests. "I can't help you anymore, Marquis," I said quietly. "But you always said..." "I know what I used to say, but things have changed." He shifted his weight from foot to foot as if he wanted to step out of his own skin. "It's not for me," he blurted. "It's really not. It's for the business. I told you, if I don't pay my share, they'll cut me out. I'll lose everything." "You don't have anything," I replied, my tone gently ruthless. "Nothing they can still take." His jaw clenched. In that moment, the boyishness fell away. He was no longer the child who used to hand me crayon drawings, but a man who had dug holes too deep to climb out of. "Please," he whispered. I just need enough to prove I still have a stake in the deal." I thought of the water, the shove, his shaky but eager voice echoing over the dock. "She went under fast." "No," I said. "What?" His head snapped up. "No, Marquis, I'm not giving you anything." His face flushed with anger. I thought he might shout, but something in my eyes made him stop. Maybe it was the clarity he wasn't used to seeing in me. Maybe it was the cold I'd brought back from the bottom of the bay. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I don't have time. Reggie says..." I let that name hang in the air. "Reggie says..." Of course he does. I didn't need to know what Reggie had promised. I didn't need to hear them rehearse the lines they'd already practiced. I'd heard enough last night. I stepped back and opened the door wider, not to invite him in, but to usher him out. "I hope you managed to sort out your affairs," I said. "But that's your business, not mine." He stood frozen for a beat, then backed away, one step at a time, until his heels touched the edge of the porch. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "I've made plenty," I replied. "This isn't one of them." He turned and walked off, the gravel crunching sharply under his feet. Then the silence returned. I closed the door, laid my hand against it, and exhaled slowly. No racing heart, no trembling hands. The lake had already pulled all that weakness out of me last night. Back in the kitchen, I pulled the folder toward me and flipped through the pages. The numbers no longer hurt. They were simply facts, blunt, exposed, no longer hidden. I was no longer their wallet. And soon they would feel the absence of the quiet compliance they'd been exploiting for years. I looked out the window. The street was empty again, peaceful as always. Let them come, one by one. I'd already survived worse. Cold water had taught me something my family never managed to learn. Some things in this world can be pushed, and some cannot. And as for me, I was done being pushed. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Not because of nightmares, those had burned themselves out the night they pushed me into the water, but because a single thought clung to me and refused to let go. The cameras. The thing they were so sure wouldn't capture anything. The thing they never bothered to pay attention to. Evidence doesn't shout. It just sits quietly and waits for the moment it's needed. I dressed slowly, feeling every year in my knees, then wrapped a scarf around my neck. The mornings had turned bitter lately, the kind of cold that slipped through every layer of fabric and settled deep in your bones. Even so, I stepped outside, locked the door, and walked to the car. The drive to Middle Branch Marina was strangely quiet. No music, no radio, just the sound of the tires rolling over asphalt and my own breathing. I parked in the gravel lot, the very spot where we used to stop for summer picnics back when Simone was little. Funny how one place can hold both happy memories and filthy betrayal, yet its face remains exactly the same. The marina office was a low building with peeling paint and a window that had long since fogged permanently from damp. Inside, a young man sat behind the counter, feet propped up, half asleep over a cup of coffee. He jumped to his feet as soon as he saw me walk in. "Good morning, ma'am. What can I do for you?" "I need to see the footage from last night at Dock 3, I said plainly. He frowned. "Are you a boat owner, ma'am?" "No." "Security can't release footage unless you're involved in some kind of incident, ma'am." "I am involved," I replied. He straightened. Involved in what kind of incident, exactly?" I looked him straight in the eye. The kind you don't talk about in a hallway. He hesitated, then stood up. Yes, ma'am. Let me get the manager." The manager came out, a woman around 50, her skin darkened by years of sea wind, carrying the calm of someone who has seen just about everything that can happen near water. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw me. "You said you need to see the footage?" she asked. "That's right." "May I ask why?" "Because last night someone tried to kill me," I answered. The young man behind her sucked in a loud breath. The manager didn't flinch. She looked at me the way a nurse studies a wound, quietly, precisely, without pity. "Come with me," she said. She led me into a back room where the walls were lined with surveillance screens. On the monitors, I saw rippling water, empty docks, a few fishing boats bobbing in place. With a few keystrokes, she pulled up Dock 3. "Are you sure you want to see this?" she turned and asked. "I'm sure." The footage played. I saw myself, small, frail, sitting in the wheelchair, looking no different than a broken object being rolled to the edge, and behind me, the three of them. Reggie's hands gripped firmly on the wheelchair handles. Marquis kept glancing around nervously. Simone stood a step behind, just far enough to pretend she wasn't truly involved. I watched their mouths move. I couldn't hear the audio, but I remembered every word. Then came the shove. My body pitched forward, dropping out of frame and into the water. My daughter turned her face away. The manager let out a breath, quiet but audible. "Damn." I didn't react. My hands lay still on my lap. I had already lived that moment once. Seeing it again didn't hurt more. It only confirmed what the lake had already told me. They had made their choice. Now it was my turn. "I'll need a copy," I said. She nodded. "I can download it for you. Would you like it on a USB or a disk?" "USB." She worked in silence, fingers gliding over the keyboard. When she handed me the USB, her fingertips rested on my hand for just a second longer than necessary. "You going to the police station?" she asked, her voice low. "In due time," I replied. "Do you want me to file a report right now?" "No, not yet." She studied me once more, then nodded with a kind of respect I hadn't felt from a stranger in a very long time. "If you need anything at all, you come back and find me, all right?" "I understand," I said. I slipped the USB into my coat pocket. It was tiny, almost weightless. Strange how something so small can hold the truth of an entire life. If you've listened this far, you might be wondering, why didn't she go straight to the police? Why take the long way around? Trust me, when your entire family are the ones who pushed you into the water, you understand this. Sometimes, before you throw the first punch, you need to know what you're fighting for and who you're saying goodbye to. Leaving the office, the wind from the water cut across my coat. This time I didn't shiver. My steps were slow but steady. I walked past the dock where it had all happened. The boards still gleamed faintly with the damp that clung from the night before. It was right here they stood, certain I would disappear quietly under the surface, certain no one would ever know what they'd done. But I knew. And now the cameras did too. I opened the car door, sat down, and drew a deep breath before starting the engine. But I didn't drive straight home. There was somewhere else I needed to be first. A place Walter and I used to go whenever we needed to remember who we were before life became too heavy. I drove to Riverside Park, the old public pier on the outskirts of Baltimore. The wood of the dock was worn, bleached, its edges softened by years of sun and wind. Walter used to bring me here when we were young, long before money became a dark shadow hanging over our lives. Back then, he'd pack 2 sandwiches and a thermos of sweet tea. We'd sit at the end of the pier, our feet dangling over the water. He'd talk about everything: fishing, the work at the plant, the strange dream he had about building a wooden boat he never quite found the time to finish. I would sit and listen, my head resting on his shoulder, letting that steady voice sand down the rough edges of a long day. It was here that he told me he wanted children, here that we argued about whether we could ever really afford a house, and here, too, that he held my hand the night we got the call from his job, the call that knocked everything off its axis and planted the seed for that $11 million settlement years later. He hadn't been born to sue anyone. He'd been born to fix things with his hands, not to fight companies with steel teeth. But he did it anyway, because we had no choice, because the injury that wrecked his back also wrecked the future we had drawn together. Sometimes I think that money did more damage than the injury ever did. I sat down on the same stretch of wood where we used to eat our sandwiches. The pier groaned softly under my weight. I could almost see him sitting across from me. Sun-browned skin, calloused hands, eyes soft when they looked at me and hard when they looked at anyone who dared shove me aside. He would have hated what my family had become. He would have hated seeing me tiptoe around their wants, shrinking myself so this house could stay peaceful. He used to tell me, "Dolores, being quiet doesn't mean being small. Don't let them confuse the two." But when you love people, especially when you love your own blood, you forgive too much. You bow your head for so long that one day you realize bowed is just how you stand now. I sat there a long time, listening to the water slapping against the posts, letting myself remember the things I'd too easily pushed into the dark. The long months after Walter died, the sudden interest the family took in my finances, the way Reggie talked about protecting my assets while slowly moving them around like chess pieces only he could see on the board, the way Simone started showing up with that tired, guilty smile every time he made a decision in my name, the way Marquis rose and fell in my life like a tide, always carrying a story about a cheating partner, a missed opportunity, and just a little more money to win it back. I had ignored too many signs just because I wanted to believe that even if love was worn thin, it was still there. The wind picked up, tugging my hair loose. My eyes watered, not from emotion, but from the cold cutting across my face. I pressed my palm flat against the wood, feeling the grain under my fingertips. It was the same surface Walter had braced his hand against when he leaned in to kiss me. "I should have been left with something cleaner than this," I murmured. "Not this mess." The pier creaked as if it too were tired, but still answered with the low whisper of old wood. I got to my feet slowly, careful to keep my balance. My legs no longer tolerated long periods of sitting. I brushed off my coat and gave the empty dock one last look. I hadn't come here for comfort. I'd come because I needed to remember who I used to be, before the years softened me into someone easy to take advantage of. I walked away from the pier with heavier steps. Yes, grief has weight, but they were steadier too. Grief, if you let it stand in the right place, can become a spine. At the car, I paused, pulling in the cold air until my chest burned. Then I sat down behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove off. I still had a house to return to, and a war to fight, one that, this time, no longer frightened me. I didn't drive straight home from the pier. I sat behind the wheel for quite a while, engine off, just watching the sun slowly climb a little higher over the water. My fingers kept drifting to my coat pocket, where the USB lay. It was tiny, but felt like it was holding a truth that had already been loaded. Small, silent, designed to finish things. Finally, I turned the key and steered the car back toward town. Not to the police station. Not yet. Justice, rushed, is just as easily twisted. Walter used to say that. He was the kind of man who was patient, hard to anger. But once he took action, he did it cleanly, completely. I had forgotten that part of him for years, buried it under layers of compromise and exhausted hope. Now, it felt like that very part of him was placing a hand on my shoulder, pulling me back up straight. So I did not run to the police. I drove to the only person I still trusted enough to hand something this big to. Attorney Curtis Langford's office sat above a hardware store on Charles Street, same spot it had been in since the 90s. The paint on the stairway railing was peeling in long strips, but the steps under my feet were still solid. Old age does not let you move fast, but it teaches you to put each step down with purpose. At the landing, I had to pause to catch my breath. The office door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Curtis looked up from a pile of files, his glasses sliding down his nose. For a moment, he squinted at me as if he thought his eyes were playing tricks. Then he shot to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward. "Dolores! Good Lord, you look—" He stopped himself. "You are not hurt, are you?" "No," I said. "Just a little older than I was yesterday." He studied me for a few more seconds, reading what was etched into my face. The kind of look only someone who has seen you carry grief on your body can give. Then he gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit. Tell me everything." I didn't speak right away. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket, took out the USB, and placed it on the desk. Curtis did not touch it. Not at first. Old lawyers understand very well. Some small, quiet things can blow an entire life wide open. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dropping. "Evidence," I said, "of an attempted murder." He took a deep breath but did not interrupt. I told him what had happened at the bay, slowly, clearly, carefully, like you tell a doctor where it hurts without having to scream. His expression shifted as I spoke. At first disbelief, then anger, then the hollow look of a man picturing something he wishes he did not have to picture. When I finished, he leaned back and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Dear God, Dolores," he murmured, "your own family did this to you." "Yes," I replied. "You should have called the police immediately." "I know. But you have not." "Not yet." He let out a long, heavy sigh. Then he laced his fingers together on the desk and looked straight at me. "All right," he said. "Then tell me this. What do you want?" It was the first time all morning my throat tightened. What did I want? For years, the only thing I had wanted was peace. A place at the table, a phone call that did not come with a price tag, a family that saw me as a person, not a walking bank account. But that chapter had sunk under the water last night. "I want to take back control," I said, "over my money, my house, my name." Curtis nodded. "Reasonable." "I want protection, on paper, in the law, irreversible, something no one can reach their hands into." Also very reasonable. "And I want time before I hand this USB over to the police. I want to understand the full picture before I bind their hands with evidence." He watched me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though he were passing sentence. "Then we are going to do this methodically." If you are thinking, why not just throw them all in jail already and be done with it? I understand. But when the people who tried to kill you are your daughter, your son-in-law, your own nephew, it is not as simple as punching in the number for the police. Sometimes, before you drag the light in, you have to straighten up your own room first. And that is exactly what I was about to do. Curtis unlocked a drawer and pulled out a stack of standard forms. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork. But paperwork, in the right hands at the right time, can move mountains. "We will start with a new financial power of attorney," he said, marking boxes with a blue pen. "Not for your daughter, not for your son-in-law, not for that nephew, someone neutral, someone you can trust." I thought of my granddaughter, Layla, 24, solid as rock, a soft voice and a spine much stronger than people assumed. "Yes," I said. "My granddaughter Layla. She will do it well." He wrote Layla's name down carefully. "Then we will set up a limited trust," he continued. "You will still retain full control, but your assets will be shielded. If your family tries anything, they are going to slam into a legal wall." He paused, his eyes flicking to the USB on the desk. "And that," he said, "will go into my safe until you are ready." I nodded. He opened another drawer and took out a small, heavy lockbox. When he placed the USB inside, something in my chest sagged. Not relief exactly. Relief comes after danger has passed. This felt more like finally setting down a stone you have carried alone, in the dark, all night. He closed the safe, and the lock snapped shut with a clean, sharp sound. "That," he said slowly, "is the sound of a future no longer chained to the people who tried to push you into the water." I exhaled, long and slow. We worked for nearly 2 hours, form after form, signature after signature. Eventually, my hand began to cramp, but I did not complain. Never in my life had signing my own name felt so much like slowly reclaiming my life. When everything was done, Curtis stood, walked around the desk, and gently helped me to my feet. "Dolores," he said softly, "you know what the next step is, don't you?" "I do." "You know they will strike back." "I expect nothing less." "And you know—" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "This is going to hurt." I looked him straight in the eye. "It already did, last night." He nodded, understanding everything I did not put into words. I left the office and stepped back into the hallway, the worn boards creaking under my shoes. Outside, the wind had picked up. A cold, blunt wind, the kind that clears out stale air. I pulled my coat tighter around me and walked down the stairs. Each step was slow, sure, the pace of someone who has finally stopped running away from her own life. I did not look back. I did not need to anymore. I did not have to wait long for the storm to arrive. The next afternoon, just after 3, I heard an engine roar up my driveway. Too fast, too loud, the kind of noise a man makes when he feels the whole world sliding out of his grip and thinks driving harder might hold it together. I did not have to part the curtain. I knew that sound by instinct, the way some people know thunder before the sky actually breaks. Reggie. I set my teacup down, wiped my hands on my skirt, and walked to the door at my own pace. Not hurried, not shaking. I opened the door before he could knock. He stood there, face flushed, breathing hard, his tie crooked as if he'd just yanked it loose in a rage. For years he had worn confidence like cologne, thick, showy, suffocating. Today, that cologne was peeling off in patches. "Where have you been?" he growled. "I have been in my house," I answered. "You are not answering your phone." "I do not want to listen." His jaw twitched. He strode right past me, without waiting to be invited in, as if this were still his territory. Maybe I had let him get used to that before, out of sheer exhaustion. Not today. "Your accounts," he said. "They are frozen, completely. Did you know that?" I did. I could not pay the property insurance yesterday. I could not move repair funds. I could not— "That is right," I cut in calmly. "You cannot do any of that anymore." He stared at me, something clumsy and uneven flickering between anger and panic in his eyes. "Why would you do that? Out of nowhere." "Out of nowhere?" I tilted my head. "Reggie, nothing about this is out of nowhere. It only feels sudden to you because this is the first time I have stopped obediently going along." His nostrils flared. "Your daughter is terrified," he snapped. "Simone says you are acting strange, paranoid. She also told me she was sorry." I said mildly, interrupting him. Those two lines came out of the same mouth. Interesting, isn't it? Reggie faltered. Silence poured into the room, slow and heavy, like water seeping into a hull that has already been breached. I do not know what you think you are doing, he said at last. But you cannot just cut us off like this. We have been managing everything for you for years. You need us. I looked him straight in the eye. You tried to kill me. He froze. The house did not. The clock kept ticking. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Life went on, utterly indifferent to the moment a lie shattered. What? Reggie's voice thinned. At Middle Branch, I said. On the dock, that shove, the water, the three of you turning your backs and walking away. A small spasm crossed his face. You are confused. No, I remember very clearly. The calm surface of his act cracked, just a little, but enough. You do not have proof, he said quickly. I almost smiled. Yes, I do. What proof? The marina cameras. For a second, he seemed to forget how to breathe. Then he gave a short, sharp, desperate laugh. There are no cameras pointed directly at that dock. There are now. The laugh died. He took half a step forward, then stopped, as if suddenly remembering he was no longer standing in the stronger position. What do you want? I do not want anything from you anymore. You cannot just— I can, Reggie, I said evenly, and I already have. His polished mask shattered completely. If you take this to the police, we are finished. Marquis, Simone, all of us. You should have thought of that before you pushed me into the water. He scrubbed a hand over his mouth, eyes darting toward the window, as if expecting patrol cars to appear. We can work this out, he said hastily. Sit down and talk, like a family. We stopped being a family the moment you put your hands on the back of my wheelchair. He seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging, his breath uneven. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. You will not walk away from this untouched, he whispered. I already have. He shot me a glare, jaw clenched, then spun around and slammed the door behind him like a threat that never quite formed. I stepped forward, gently closed the door, and slid the latch. The click of the lock was dry and sharp. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. Any scraps of fear that might have clung to me melted away with that sound. If you are thinking, well, that is it then. Time to throw the whole lot of them in jail. Not so fast. The best part of this story is not the moment the handcuffs snap shut, but everything that happens after, when the people who thought they held all the power have to face real consequences. And believe me, the legal storm had only just started to gather. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The footage from the marina spoke louder than any trembling statement ever could. 2 days after that confrontation, a patrol car stopped in front of my house. This time, I was not the one waiting to hear the brakes. From the window, I saw Reggie standing on the grass, hands cuffed, his face stripped bare of the arrogance he had always worn. He did not look at my house even once. Not once. Shame has its own weight. It pushes a person's head down toward the ground they once walked on, as though it belonged to them. Marquis was arrested an hour later. Curtis called to tell me, "He ran," he said, but he did not get far. Running had always been Marquis' instinct. Standing still and taking responsibility was the one thing he had never learned to do. Simone was not arrested. She had not laid a hand on me. She had not pushed. Her crime was silence. And silence is hard to fit neatly into any box on a charge sheet. But that afternoon, she came. Her knock was very soft. I opened the door. Her eyes were red, mascara smeared, hair a mess, coat buttoned crooked. She looked more like the 12-year-old girl she had once been than the grown woman who had stood on that dock yesterday watching her mother disappear. "Mom," her voice was hoarse, "they arrested Reggie." "I know." The police. They showed me the video." I avoided her gaze and stepped back to let her in. She walked like she was stepping on glass. In the living room, she hesitated in front of Walter's armchair before sitting down, shoulders hunched, hands wrung together. "I did not think he would actually do it," she stammered. "He said it was just to scare you, to pressure you so you would listen to us. I thought at worst it would be some cruel joke. I did not know he would push you." "You knew enough," I said. Not harsh, just true. She swallowed hard. "I was scared of him." "I know. And I was scared of losing everything." I sat in the chair opposite her. "Fear does not excuse what happened, Simone." "I know." She wiped at her tears in a clumsy swipe. "I did not come here to ask you to protect me. I know what I did, or rather, what I did not do. I just need to know. Do you hate me?" The question hung between us. Hate is a heavy word. Too heavy to drop onto the shoulders of someone you once held in your arms, someone you sang to sleep when she was small, who used to fear the dark and would only calm down if she could hold your hand. "No," I said at last. "I do not hate you." Her shoulders shook. Tears slid down into her cupped palms. "But," I added, "I am not going to pretend it never happened." She nodded, small, trembling, but honest. "I want to make this right," she whispered. "I do not know where to start, but I want to try." "You start," I said, "by standing on your own 2 feet, not on my shoulders." She nodded again. When she left, the air in the room grew heavy, but it was no longer the suffocating weight of betrayal. It was the weight of consequence. And consequence, unlike betrayal, has sharp edges, but it does not drown you. That evening, Curtis called. His voice was as steady as ever, but I could hear the anger folded tightly beneath his professionalism. "Dolores, I have reviewed the preliminary audit. You had better sit down." "I am already sitting." "Good. Your son-in-law opened 2 lines of credit in your name. 1 5 years ago, 1 last year. The total is close to $300,000. I stayed silent for a moment. "That money is gone," he went on. "No investments, no assets, nothing in your name except legal liability." "And Marquis?" I asked. "Worse." Papers rustled at his end. "He used your information to guarantee a loan tied to an investment group currently under federal investigation. His name is nowhere on the documents." He paused. "Yours is." I closed my eyes, that familiar ache pressing behind them again. "Federal?" I asked. "Yes. If the investigation touches you, I will step in immediately. But Dolores, Reggie and Marquis were not just taking advantage of you. They were laying out their escape routes using your identity as a cushion. If they fall, they will try to drag you down with them." That no longer frightened me. "They will not," I said. The next day, I went back to Curtis's office. He was waiting with a thick stack of documents. New protections, new legal walls, barriers that even blood relatives could not cross if their intention was to harm me. When I signed the final page, Curtis looked up. "Essentially, you have cut them off, Dolores." "No," I corrected, setting the pen down. "They cut themselves off. I just turned it into ink on paper." He nodded, a small, knowing nod. On the drive home, the sky turned a cold, metallic silver. The world looked harsher, but cleaner. Back at the house, I placed the signed documents in a drawer. I did not hide them. I simply put them where they belonged. Their choices had built this storm. My choices would stop it. And for the first time in many years, I could clearly feel one simple thing beneath my feet. The ground under me was holding firm. In the weeks following the arrests, my home grew quiet, in a way completely different from before. It was no longer the suffocating silence that sat on my chest like a stone, but a clear, clean stillness. I woke up each morning without holding my breath, wondering what else they would take from me that day. At 78, that alone felt like a small miracle. I sold the old house in Baltimore and moved to a small place near the beach in Ocean City. The little house was painted white, the paint peeling here and there, the wooden floors creaking, the smell of salt slipping in through the windows. It had no history, no ghosts in the corners, just enough empty space for an old woman to start over without asking anyone's permission. In the evenings, I would take a cup of tea out to the sand, sit on a washed-up log, and watch the waves. My body still hurt, but not the way it had when betrayal was gnawing at me. This was the ordinary ache of age, of a life fully lived. Reggie and Marquis waited for their day in court. Simone stopped by from time to time, saying little and listening more. I did not promise forgiveness, but I did not slam the door either. Some wounds need time. The rest is simple. I chose to live the days I have left for myself, not for someone else's greed, not for anyone's fear, just for the peace I had to swim out of cold water to reclaim. And if you have stayed with me all the way to these last lines, remember this: do not wait until someone pushes you into deep water to start taking your life back. Choose yourself while you are still standing. If this story touched you, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss the next ones. Who knows? One day you might find a piece of your own life in these stories.